6 feet of snow. Not snow that fell naturally from the sky. 6 feet of snow pushed directly onto my property at 4 in the morning by the man who called himself the neighborhood's security patrol coordinator. They thought I would stay quiet. They thought I would shovel it myself, swallow my anger, and move on like everyone else before me. They didn't know I had 4 security cameras running 24/7. They didn't think I had been saving footage for 3 winters. And they certainly didn't expect me to use that same snow to block the only road out of their cul-de-sac. Comment below where you're watching from, because this story will show you exactly what happens when an HOA Karen picks the wrong neighbor to bully. My name is Garrett Harrison, and this is how I turned their weapon into their prison. I woke up to silence. That particular kind of winter silence that tells you something has changed overnight, when the snow absorbs every sound, and the world feels wrapped in cotton. The storm had passed through Minneapolis like a freight train, dumping 18 inches in 48 hours. And I had spent the previous evening watching it pile up against the windows of my house at the end of Pinecrest Estate's only cul-de-sac. I made coffee, pulled on a sweatshirt, and walked to the back window that overlooked my side yard. What I saw made me set the mug down so hard that coffee splashed across the counter. There was a mountain where my lawn used to be, not a drift, not an accumulation, a deliberate, mechanical, man-made mountain of snow nearly 6 feet tall, stretching from my fence line halfway across the yard. I pulled on boots and a jacket and walked outside. The air bit at my face, somewhere around 5 degrees, but I barely noticed. Up close, the snow pile was even more unnatural. The surface showed distinct scrape marks from a plow blade, parallel grooves carved into the compacted white soil. The base had spread wide enough to completely block the sidewalk I used to access my backyard. 2 boards of my wooden fence had cracked under the weight, splintered outward like broken ribs. This wasn't weather. This was an assault. I circled the pile slowly, taking photographs with my phone, capturing the plow marks, the damaged fence, and the way the snow had been pushed well past the property line that separated my lot from the HOA's designated common area. I knew exactly where that line was. I had walked it with a surveyor when I bought this house 5 years ago. Every inch of this frozen monument sat on land I owned. I went back inside and logged into my security system. 4 cameras covered my property, recording continuously to cloud storage with 90 days of retention. I had installed them after my wife passed, when the house felt too quiet, and I wanted to know what happened around it, even when I wasn't paying attention. I never imagined they would capture something like this. I scrolled back through the night's footage, past the hours of falling snow, until I found it. 4:17 in the morning. A pickup truck with a plow attachment appeared at the edge of the frame, headlights cutting through the storm. The driver made 3 passes along the HOA common area, pushing snow toward the back of the cul-de-sac. Standard procedure. Then he stopped. The truck idled for almost a full minute, and then he angled the blade and drove directly toward my property line, pushing the accumulated snow over the boundary and onto my side yard. He did it 4 more times, each pass adding to the pile, until the mountain I had discovered this morning took shape. I recognized the truck. More importantly, I recognized the man behind the wheel when he stepped out briefly to inspect his work. Frank Kowalski, husband of Brenda Kowalski, our HOA president, self-appointed security patrol coordinator, a title that appeared nowhere in our community bylaws, but which he wore like a badge of actual authority. Frank stood in my side yard for nearly 30 seconds, looking at the snow pile, then looking toward my darkened house. The camera caught his expression clearly. He was smiling. This wasn't an accident or a miscalculation. This was intentional. I saved the footage to 3 separate locations and kept watching. That's when I noticed the second vehicle, parked on the street near the cul-de-sac entrance. Lights off, engine running. Based on the exhaust visible in the cold air, someone was sitting inside, watching Frank work. I zoomed in as far as the resolution allowed. The car was a silver Lexus SUV. Brenda Kowalski drove a silver Lexus SUV. She had been there. She had supervised the entire operation. I called the HOA's main line at 9 o'clock. The earliest time the recorded message said someone would be available. Brenda answered on the second ring, her voice carrying that particular brightness of someone who expects every call to be a minor inconvenience she can dismiss. I identified myself and described what I had found on my property. I told her I had video evidence of the snow being deliberately placed there by her husband. I asked when it would be removed. There was a pause, and when she spoke again, the brightness had sharpened into something harder. She told me that the area was the designated snow dump site for community maintenance. She told me everyone had to make sacrifices during the winter months. She told me the HOA would not be dispatching anyone to move snow that was exactly where it was supposed to be. I reminded her that my property was not an HOA common area, that I had a survey and a deed that proved it. She laughed, a short sound without warmth. She said I was welcome to file a formal complaint if I felt so strongly about it, and then she hung up. I stood in my kitchen, phone still in hand, looking out the window at the pile of snow that didn't belong there. I thought about the fence boards I would need to replace. I thought about the sidewalk I couldn't use until spring. I thought about Frank's smile in the security footage and Brenda's car watching from the shadows. I thought about all the winters I had lived here, 5 years of quiet coexistence, and I wondered how many times this had happened to someone else without cameras to prove it. I didn't call back. I didn't send an angry email. Instead, I created a new folder on my computer, labeled it with the date, and began building a file. If they wanted to make this about property lines and community rules, then that's exactly the game we would play, and I intended to know every rule better than they did. 3 days passed. The snow remained. I sent a formal email to the HOA board on the morning after my call with Brenda, documenting everything with timestamps and attached photographs. I requested the removal of the illegally dumped material and compensation for my damaged fence. I received an automated reply confirming receipt. Then nothing. No response. No acknowledgement. No action. The mountain of snow sat on my property like a monument to their indifference, slowly compacting under its own weight, the broken fence boards poking through the white surface like accusatory fingers. On the 4th day, I spent 4 hours with a shovel, clearing just enough of the pile to access my sidewalk again. My back ached for 3 days afterward. The main pile was too large for one person to move without equipment, and I wasn't about to spend hundreds of dollars solving a problem someone else had deliberately created. On day 5, Frank Kowalski came to visit. I was in my garage, organizing tools, when I heard the crunch of tires on snow and saw his pickup truck pull into my driveway. He parked directly behind my car, blocking my exit, and left the engine running, with yellow hazard lights flashing, as if he were conducting some kind of official traffic stop. He stepped out wearing a black vest with the word security printed in reflective letters across the back, the kind of costume that means nothing legally but impresses people who don't know better. He walked toward my garage with the deliberate swagger of a man who believed his authority was absolute. I set down the wrench I was holding and waited. He stopped about 6 feet away, close enough to assert dominance, far enough to claim he wasn't being aggressive. He told me he had received reports that I was planning to move snow onto the public roadway. He told me that would be a violation of community security protocols. He told me I needed to leave the snow exactly where it was. I asked him which protocol specifically prohibited a homeowner from removing material that had been illegally dumped on their property. He stared at me for a moment, the way someone stares when they're not used to being questioned. He said he didn't need to show me anything. He said he was the security patrol coordinator, and his word was sufficient. I told him that the title didn't appear anywhere in our HOA bylaws, that he had no legal authority to enforce anything, and that he was currently trespassing on my driveway without invitation. His expression changed then, the performative professionalism dropping away to reveal something uglier underneath. He stepped closer and lowered his voice. He told me to watch myself. He said people who didn't cooperate with community security tended to have problems. He said it would be a shame if my property developed other issues that required attention. Then he turned, walked back to his truck, and drove away without looking back. I stood in my garage doorway and watched him go, then walked inside and added the encounter to my file. Timestamp, description, exact quotes as best I could recall. If he wanted to threaten me on my own property, I would make sure there was a record. The monthly HOA board meeting fell on the following Thursday. I attended for the first time in 3 years, taking a seat near the back of the community clubhouse where about 20 residents had gathered. Brenda Kowalski presided from a table at the front, flanked by 4 other board members who nodded along with everything she said like synchronized accessories. When the agenda reached open comments, I raised my hand, Brenda's smile tightened almost imperceptibly before she acknowledged me. I stood and described the situation calmly, factually, without emotion. I explained that snow had been deliberately pushed onto my private property in violation of state law and local ordinance. I mentioned that I had video evidence clearly showing the action and the individuals responsible. Before I could offer to share the footage, Brenda interrupted. She said personal recordings were not appropriate for board meetings. She said this was a matter of community snow management, not individual grievance. She said the board would take my concerns under advisement. Then she called for a vote on whether to take further action. 4 hands went up in favor of her position. One board member, a quiet woman I didn't recognize, kept her hand down, 4-1, no further action needed. I sat back down and understood something important. This board wasn't a governing body. It was a rubber stamp for whatever Brenda Kowalski wanted. After the meeting adjourned, I lingered near the exit, watching residents file out. An older woman approached me hesitantly, glancing around as if checking for observers. Her name was Olivia Baker. She said, "She lived 3 houses down from me, the small blue Cape Cod with the bird feeders. She had seen me speak at the meeting. She wanted me to know this had happened to her 2 years ago. Frank had dumped snow on her walkway, blocking her front door for nearly a week. She had complained. The following month, she received 3 violation notices for issues that had never been cited before. Her mailbox was 2 inches too close to the curb. Her porch light was the wrong color temperature. Her recycling bin had been visible from the street for more than 12 hours. She paid the fines because she couldn't afford to fight. She was 67 years old, living alone on a fixed income, and she couldn't afford that battle. I asked her if she had documentation. She said she kept everything, but she had been too scared to use it. I thanked her and gave her my phone number. I told her she wasn't alone anymore. I drove home with Olivia's story echoing in my mind, adding another layer to the pattern I was beginning to see. Brenda and Frank hadn't done this once. They had done it repeatedly, targeting people they perceived as vulnerable, people who would complain quietly and then submit. I was supposed to be another name on that list. I pulled into my driveway, walked inside, and opened my laptop to check email. There was a new message from the HOA, sent 45 minutes earlier, while I was still at the meeting. The subject line read, "Violation Notice." I clicked it open. The notice cited Section 4.7 of the Community Guidelines, improper storage of materials creating visual blight. The violation snow piled in the yard exceeds height regulations. The fine, $150, due in 14 days. I read it twice to make sure I understood correctly. They were fining me for the snow pile that they had put on my property. I closed the laptop slowly, leaned back in my chair, and started to laugh. Not because it was funny, because it was so perfectly, absurdly corrupt that laughing was the only response that made sense. They had just made a very serious mistake. They had put their accusation in writing. I did not pay the fine. I did not respond to the email. I did not give them the satisfaction of an angry reply they could use to paint me as the unreasonable party. Instead, I did what I do best. I researched. I spent the weekend at my kitchen table with my laptop open to Minnesota state statutes, local ordinances, and every HOA-related legal precedent I could find in Hennepin County court records. By Sunday evening, I had filled 12 pages of notes and highlighted 3 key facts that would become the foundation of everything that followed. First, Minnesota Statute Section 609.605 explicitly prohibited depositing snow, ice, or other materials on private property without the owner's consent. Second, local ordinance required that snow removed from private roads be deposited only on common areas or public right-of-ways designated by the city. Third, and most importantly, there was no such thing as a legally recognized security patrol coordinator in the state of Minnesota. I called the Hennepin County Sheriff's Office on Monday morning. I explained that I was having a dispute with my HOA and asked about the legal authority of a private security patrol operating within a residential community. The deputy who took my call was patient and thorough. He confirmed what I had suspected. A private citizen wearing a security vest and driving a truck with flashing lights had no more legal authority than any other neighbor. They could not issue violations. They could not enforce community rules. They could not detain anyone or demand identification. They could not threaten consequences for non-compliance. Everything Frank Kowalski had done on my driveway was theater, a performance designed to intimidate people who didn't know their rights. Minnesota is a one-party consent state for recording phone calls. I saved the audio file to my evidence folder and made a backup on an external drive. Another piece of the puzzle locked into place. I submitted a formal public records request to the HOA that afternoon, asking for complete copies of the community bylaws, the CC&Rs, and all financial records from the past 3 years. State law required them to provide governing documents to any resident who requested them. The financial records were a long shot, but HOAs in Minnesota were required to make certain budget information available upon request. I wanted to see exactly how much money was flowing through this organization, and more importantly, where it was going. I also searched the state's business registry for any entity matching Pinecrest Security Patrol or similar variations. Nothing came up. Frank's little operation existed nowhere in official records. It was a fiction he and Brenda had invented, funded by HOA dues, accountable to no one. The more I dug, the more the picture clarified. This wasn't just petty neighborhood politics. This was a systematic abuse of power, protected by bureaucratic opacity and the assumption that no one would ever bother to look closely. Tyler came home for winter break 3 days before Christmas. My son was 19, a computer science major at the state university, and he had inherited his mother's talent for seeing patterns in chaos. I hadn't planned to involve him in any of this, but when he walked through the door and saw the snow pile still sitting on the side yard, he asked questions. I showed him the footage. I showed him the violation notice. I showed him Frank's visit and the board meeting dismissal. He sat at the kitchen table scrolling through my evidence folder with the focused intensity of someone solving a puzzle. And then he looked up and said we needed to go deeper. He wanted to see all the footage, not just from this winter, but from every winter since I installed the cameras. I had 3 years of archived recordings stored on a backup server in the basement. I had never reviewed most of it. That night, we started watching. It took us 2 evenings to get through the relevant segments, fast-forwarding through hours of empty frames until we found what we were looking for. The pattern was unmistakable. Frank Kowalski had pushed snow onto my property every single winter for 3 years. Not always as much as this year, but enough to notice if you were looking. A drift here, an overflow there, always from the same angle, always with the same plow blade marks. I had never paid close attention before. I had assumed it was accidental, the natural consequence of living at the end of a cul-de-sac near the community snow dump site. But the footage told a different story. Each year, Frank's passes became more deliberate, his encroachments more significant. This year was simply the most extreme example of something that had been happening all along. Tyler organized the clips into a timeline, adding timestamps and annotations. When he was finished, we had a visual record of 3 years of systematic trespassing, documented down to the minute. The final piece fell into place on Christmas Eve. I was searching through old emails, looking for any previous communication with the HOA about snow removal, when I found it. A message I had sent 2 Januaries ago, politely asking if the plowing contractor could avoid pushing snow so close to my fence line. Brenda Kowalski had replied personally. Her exact words were, "Thank you for bringing this to our attention. We'll try to be more careful going forward." I read the email 3 times, letting the implications settle. She had acknowledged the problem. She had promised to address it. And then, instead of being more careful, they had escalated. This year's mountain wasn't an accident or an oversight. It was a choice made with full knowledge that they were crossing a line. I printed the email and added it to my file. They couldn't claim ignorance anymore. I had proof that they knew. Tyler found me in the garage that evening, staring out the window at the snow pile that had become the centerpiece of my winter. He asked what the plan was. I looked at my pickup truck parked in the corner, the plow attachment I used to clear my own driveway and occasionally help elderly neighbors after storms. I had bought it 3 years ago, back when I thought being useful to the community might earn me some goodwill. Now I saw it differently. I told Tyler that they had put their snow on my property. I told him I thought it was time I put it somewhere they could see it. He asked where. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I opened my phone and pulled up a satellite view of Pinecrest Estates. I zoomed in on our cul-de-sac, tracing the single road that connected our 6 houses to the rest of the neighborhood. That road passed directly in front of one particular driveway. The driveway belongs to Brenda and Frank Kowalski. Tyler looked at the screen, then looked at me, and a slow smile spread across his face. He asked when we were doing it. I told him to get some sleep. We had a long night ahead of us. Brenda Kowalski moved faster than I expected. The morning after Christmas, before Tyler and I could execute our plan, she launched her counteroffensive. I discovered it when I walked to the mailbox and passed my neighbor from 2 doors down, a man named Peterson who had always waved and made small talk about the weather. This time, he looked at me, then looked away, and walked back inside without a word. By noon, I understood. Tyler showed me the community email that had gone out overnight to all 145 households in Pinecrest Estates. The subject line read, "Important Community Safety Notice." The message, sent from the official HOA account, warned residents about a homeowner who was refusing to cooperate with winter snow management procedures and creating hazardous conditions that endangered the entire neighborhood. It didn't use my name. It didn't need to. Everyone knew who lived at the end of the cul-de-sac. The social temperature dropped faster than the weather. Over the next 3 days, neighbors I had helped with yard work stopped acknowledging me. The message board outside the clubhouse, where residents posted notices about lost pets and garage sales, now featured a printed reminder about the importance of community cooperation and the consequences of selfish behavior. Nobody signed it. Nobody needed to. Conversation stopped when I approached the mailbox cluster. Garage doors closed a little faster when my truck drove past. I was being erased from the neighborhood without anyone saying a word to my face. 5 years of being a good neighbor, of shoveling driveways and organizing block parties and donating to every fundraiser, reduced to nothing by a single email from a woman who had decided I was a problem. The isolation was surgical and complete. The violation notices arrived in a sequence too precise to be coincidental. On December 28th, failure to maintain property, citing the fence boards that Frank's snow pile had broken, $200. On December 30th, creating hazardous conditions by allowing ice accumulation on the adjacent walkway, the same walkway buried under snow, I physically could not remove, $250. Each notice was built on the last, constructing a narrative where I was responsible for the damage they had caused and the conditions they had created. Combined with the original $150 fine for the snow pile itself, I now owed $600. Each notice included a warning that unpaid fines would result in a lien on my property. They weren't just punishing me. They were building a legal record, one designed to make me look negligent if this ever reached a courtroom. The code enforcement officer arrived on New Year's Eve. Someone had called the county anonymously to report that I was illegally storing snow and creating a public nuisance. The officer was a tired-looking man in his 50s who clearly did not want to be working on a holiday. He walked around my property with a clipboard, took photographs, and asked me what was going on. I showed him the security footage, the plow marks, and the property line. I showed him the violation notices accusing me of creating the very mess that had been dumped on me. He watched and listened, made some notes, and then told me this was clearly a dispute between private parties, not a code violation. He said he would note in his report that the snow appeared to have been placed by mechanical equipment from outside the property. He wished me a happy new year and left. It wasn't a victory, but it was documentation from an outside authority, and that mattered. Olivia Baker knocked on my door that evening. She was carrying a manila folder pressed against her chest, and she glanced over her shoulder twice before stepping inside. She had seen the emails. She said she had seen this exact pattern before, when it happened to her, and when it happened to a family called the Hendersons, who had moved away rather than keep fighting. She handed me the folder. Inside were copies of every violation notice she had received after complaining about her snow incident 2 years ago. There were emails from Brenda threatening unspecified consequences. There were photographs of damage that the HOA had refused to acknowledge. She had kept everything, organized by date, documented with the paranoid precision of someone who knew she might need proof someday, but never believed she would be brave enough to use it. I asked why she was giving this to me now. She said she was tired of being afraid. She said if I was going to fight them, she wanted to help. After Olivia left, I sat alone in my kitchen with her folder and mine spread across the table. Tyler had gone to visit friends, and the house was quiet in that particular way that amplifies your thoughts. I thought about my wife, who had loved this house. who had planted the garden in the backyard and painted the front door the shade of blue that reminded her of the ocean. I thought about the 5 years I had spent here since she died, keeping the garden alive, keeping the door painted, keeping myself anchored to the place where we had been happy together. And now these people were trying to push me out with paperwork and whispers and slow suffocation. I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel since this started. Not anger, loneliness, the weight of fighting alone, but loneliness, I reminded myself, was not the same as defeat. I had evidence, I had allies, and I had a plan. Tyler came home around 11 and found me at the kitchen table, papers everywhere, a glass of whiskey untouched beside my laptop. He sat down across from me and waited. I told him about Olivia's folder. I told him about the code enforcement officer's report. I told him I had spent the evening mapping out every legal boundary of what we were about to do. Moving the snow was not illegal. I was removing material that had been dumped on my property without consent. I was placing it on a public road, which was the city's jurisdiction, not the HOA's. I was not blocking any driveway or emergency access. Every step had a legal justification. Every action had a documented reason. Tyler asked if I was sure. I told him I had never been more sure of anything. Tomorrow night, we will move that mountain, and we would do it in a way that left them no room to call us the criminals. We started at 3 in the morning on January 2nd. The temperature had dropped to 8 degrees below zero, cold enough that the snow had hardened into something closer to concrete than powder. Tyler sat in the passenger seat of my pickup truck, camera phone ready, while I backed out of the garage and attached the plow blade. The street was empty. Every house in the cul-de-sac was dark. I had chosen this hour deliberately. No traffic, no pedestrians, no risk of anyone being caught off guard by equipment moving in the darkness. The non-emergency line dispatcher I had called earlier confirmed a city plow would be dispatched within 24 to 48 hours. Until then, the road would be passable on foot, and emergency vehicles could access the area from the opposite end of the street if needed. This was removal, not obstruction. I intended to keep it that way. The first pass took the top layer off the pile, shearing through the compacted snow with a grinding noise that seemed impossibly loud in the silent night. I angled the blade and pushed the material toward the street, watching in my mirrors as Tyler recorded from the truck bed, pass by pass. The mountain on my property began to shrink. Pass by pass. The snow accumulated on the cul-de-sac road, forming a barrier that grew with each run. I worked methodically, keeping the material on the public road surface. It did not touch anyone's driveway. It did not block any mailbox or fire hydrant. It simply sat in the middle of the street, exactly where the city's plows would have deposited it if they had been responsible for clearing this neighborhood instead of the HOA's private contractor. By 5:15, the job was done. My side yard was clear for the first time in 3 weeks. The snow was no longer my problem. It was now the city's responsibility, as it should have been from the beginning. Tyler and I went back inside, ate breakfast, and waited. The sun came up around 7:30, pale winter light spreading across the neighborhood. I sat at my kitchen window with a cup of coffee and watched. At 6:45, the garage door at the Kowalski residence began to open. Brenda's silver Lexus pulled forward, stopped, and sat idling for nearly a full minute. Then the driver's door flew open. I could hear her voice from inside my house, muffled by distance and double-paned glass, but unmistakably furious. She stood in her driveway in a bathrobe and winter boots, gesturing at the snow pile. Frank emerged a moment later, still pulling on a jacket. Other neighbors began appearing at windows and doorways, drawn by the commotion. Brenda pulled out her phone, jabbed at the screen, and pressed it to her ear. I checked my watch and put on my coat. The next part would require documentation. Deputy Sheriff Willie Olson arrived 19 minutes later in a county cruiser, lights flashing but no siren. He was a tall man with the weathered patience of someone who had stopped being surprised by neighborhood disputes decades ago. Brenda met him at the edge of the snow pile, arms waving, voice carrying across the cold air in sharp bursts. I watched her point at my house 3 times in the first 30 seconds. I picked up the folder I had prepared and walked outside. Tyler followed with his phone recording. Olson saw me approaching and held up a hand to pause Brenda. He asked if I was the property owner at the end of the cul-de-sac. I confirmed that I was. He asked if I knew anything about the snow blocking the street. I told him I had removed it from my property and I explained why. I handed him the folder. Inside was the survey showing my property line. The security footage timestamps proved the snow had been dumped on my land without consent. The email from Brenda acknowledges previous complaints about snow placement. The code enforcement officer's report noted that mechanical equipment had deposited material from outside my property. The Minnesota statutes cover trespass and liability for snow removal. Olson flipped through the documents slowly, his expression neutral. When he finished, he looked at the snow pile, then at my cleared side yard, then back at the documents. He told Brenda that the snow in question had been placed on private property without the owner's consent. He said the property owner had the right to remove it. He said placing it on a public road was a matter for the city to address, not the sheriff's department. He said this appeared to be a civil dispute, not a criminal matter. Brenda's composure collapsed. She demanded that Olson arrest me for obstruction, for reckless endangerment, for anything he could think of. When he repeated that no crime had been committed, she turned to me directly. She stepped close enough that I could see the veins standing out on her neck. She told me I had made a fatal mistake. She told me she would destroy me. She told me that by the time she was finished, I would not be able to live in this neighborhood or any other neighborhood in Minnesota. Deputy Olson stepped between us immediately. He told her that what she had just said sounded very much like a threat, and he advised her to step back before she said something that would require his intervention. Brenda froze. For the first time since I had known her, she seemed to realize she had crossed a line. Behind me, Tyler kept his phone steady. I did not respond to her words. I did not need to. Everything she had said was now recorded with a timestamp, a location, and a law enforcement officer standing 3 feet away. That mattered more than any reply I could have given. The city plow arrived 31 hours after I made the call. A massive orange truck that cleared the cul-de-sac in under 20 minutes and disappeared without ceremony. By then, Brenda had already escalated to her next phase. The email went out to all 145 households on the evening of January 3rd, with a subject line that made me laugh out loud when Tyler showed it to me: domestic terrorism in our community. The message accused me of deliberately endangering residents, holding the neighborhood hostage, and demonstrating a pattern of antisocial behavior that threatened the safety and property values of everyone in Pinecrest Estates. She demanded an emergency board meeting to discuss formal action, including potential legal proceedings and my removal from the community. Frank had apparently filed a civil lawsuit claiming intentional infliction of emotional distress. The document arrived by certified mail the following morning. I signed for it, read it once, and added it to my file. They were doubling down. That was exactly what I had expected them to do. I sent my own email that evening, but not to the neighborhood. The recipient was Councilman Robert Jensen, whose name I had found 3 weeks earlier while researching HOA oversight in Hennepin County. Jensen sat on the City Council's Housing and Community Development Committee, the body responsible for investigating complaints about homeowner associations operating within city limits. I had drafted the message a dozen times, refining it until every sentence carried weight without emotion. I attached everything. The security footage spans 3 years. The timeline Tyler had compiled, the violation notices and the dates they were issued, Olivia Baker's documentation of her own experience, the code enforcement officer's report, the recording of Brenda's threat in front of Deputy Olson. I explained the pattern clearly and asked for a formal investigation into the conduct of Pinecrest Estates HOA leadership. I pressed send and closed my laptop. The next move was not mine to make. Jensen's response arrived the following afternoon, faster than I had anticipated. He thanked me for the comprehensive documentation and told me something that changed the shape of everything I thought I knew about this situation. His office had received complaints about Pinecrest Estates before, 3 separate incidents over the past 4 years, all describing similar patterns of selective enforcement and intimidation. None of those complaints had included sufficient evidence to justify opening a formal investigation. Mine did. He was forwarding my file to the city attorney's office and to the state attorney general's Consumer Protection Division, which had jurisdiction over HOA financial misconduct. He asked if I would be willing to provide testimony if the investigation moved forward. I replied within the hour and told him I would cooperate fully. I also mentioned that I had recently submitted a public records request for HOA financial statements and had not yet received a response. The financial records arrived 2 days later, hand-delivered by a board member I didn't recognize, who looked deeply uncomfortable standing on my doorstep. I thanked her and took the envelope inside. The documents covered 3 fiscal years, dense columns of numbers that would have meant nothing to most people, but told a very specific story to anyone who knew what to look for. I spread the pages across my kitchen table and started reading. It took me 4 hours to find what I was searching for, buried in a line item labeled Community Security Services. The HOA had been paying $2,400 per month to an entity called Pinecrest Patrol LLC for the past 3 years. I searched the Minnesota Secretary of State's business registry. Pinecrest Patrol LLC was registered to a residential address on Maple Court, 3 blocks from the cul-de-sac. The registered agent was Frank Kowalski. I searched the board meeting minutes for any record of a vote authorizing this contract. There was none. No competitive bidding, no disclosure of the relationship between the vendor and the HOA president's husband. Brenda had been funneling HOA dues to her own household for 36 months at a rate of $28,800 per year. The total exceeded $86,000. Tyler uploaded a carefully edited version of his footage to a local community forum that evening. The video showed the snow being dumped on my property at 4 in the morning. It showed the pile sitting untouched for 3 weeks while violation notices accumulated. It showed me removing the snow to the public road. It showed Deputy Olson confirming that no crime had been committed. And it showed Brenda Kowalski threatening to destroy me while a sheriff's deputy stood 3 feet away. Tyler added no commentary. He let the footage speak for itself. Within 48 hours, the video had been viewed over 2,000 times. Comments filled with questions about HOA authority and requests for more information. A reporter from a local news outlet sent me a direct message asking if I would be willing to discuss the situation on camera. I told her I would consider it after the official investigation had progressed. I wanted the system to work before I tried to influence public opinion. The knock on my door came on the evening of January 8th. I was in the kitchen reviewing the financial documents again, highlighting discrepancies. When the sound pulled me out of concentration, I assumed it was Olivia, who had been checking in regularly since the blockade. I opened the door and found Brenda Kowalski standing on my porch. She was alone, no Frank, no backup, no board members flanking her like accessories. Her face was different from what I had ever seen it, stripped of the performative confidence that had defined every previous interaction. She looked tired. She looked afraid. She asked if we could talk. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, considering. Then I stepped aside and let her in. I did not offer her coffee. I did not offer her a seat. I simply waited for her to say whatever she had come to say. She told me she knew about the investigation. She told me she knew about the video. She told me people were asking questions she couldn't answer, and board members who had always supported her were suddenly returning her calls with silence. She said she wanted to make a deal. She would drop all the fines. Frank would withdraw his lawsuit. She would resign quietly from the board at the next meeting, citing personal reasons. In exchange, she wanted me to withdraw my complaint, stop cooperating with the investigation, and take down the video. She presented it like a reasonable compromise, 2 neighbors finding common ground. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, I asked her one question. I asked if she was offering the same deal to Olivia Baker and to the Hendersons, who had moved away rather than keep fighting, and to every other resident she had targeted over the past 4 years. She didn't answer. I told her I would see her at the emergency board meeting. Then I opened the door and waited until she left. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for January 12th at 7 in the evening. I arrived 15 minutes early and found the clubhouse already packed. 83 residents had shown up, more than half the neighborhood, filling every folding chair and lining the walls 3 deep. Word had spread through channels I couldn't track, a combination of Tyler's video, the community email threads, and the particular gravity that draws people to watch a collision they know is coming. Brenda sat at the front table with the 4 other board members, her posture rigid, her expression carefully neutral. Frank stood against the back wall with his arms crossed, wearing his security vest as if it still meant something. Deputy Olson was there too, stationed near the exit in plain clothes. Officially off duty but present at my request to observe. I took a seat in the 3rd row next to Olivia Baker, who had arrived even earlier than I had. She squeezed my hand once without looking at me. We both knew what was about to happen. Brenda called the meeting to order and immediately moved to the first agenda item, disciplinary action against me for conduct detrimental to the community. She read from prepared notes, describing the blockade as a dangerous act of retaliation, the video as a malicious attempt to damage the HOA's reputation, and my refusal to pay violation fines as evidence of contempt for community standards. She proposed a motion to levy additional penalties and to pursue legal action for damages caused by my behavior. When she finished, she asked if anyone wished to speak in opposition. I raised my hand, she acknowledged me with a tight nod, and I walked to the front of the room. I did not raise my voice, I did not make accusations. I simply presented facts, the same way I would present engineering specifications to a client. I showed the security footage of Frank pushing snow onto my property at 4 a.m. while Brenda watched from her parked car. I showed the timeline of violation notices, each one issued for conditions created by the HOA's own actions. I showed the email from 2 years ago where Brenda had acknowledged the snow placement problem and promised to be more careful. I showed the financial records documenting 36 months of payments to Pinecrest Patrol LLC, a company owned by Frank Kowalski, totaling $86,400, with no board authorization and no competitive bidding. I showed Councilman Jensen's confirmation that the city attorney and state attorney general were now investigating. I laid each document on the table in front of the board members, like cards in a game that had already been decided. Then I stepped back and waited. The room was silent for exactly 4 seconds. Then Olivia Baker stood up. Her voice shook, but it carried. She told the room what had happened to her 2 winters ago. The snow dumped on her walkway, the violation notices that followed her complaint, the implicit threat that kept her silent until now. When she finished, another hand went up. A man I didn't recognize, middle-aged, living on the other side of the development. He described receiving 3 violations in 1 month after questioning a landscaping contract at a board meeting 2 years ago. Then another voice, a woman near the back, talking about assessment fees that never seemed to result in visible improvements. The testimonies accumulated like the evidence in my folder, each one a small piece of a pattern that had been invisible only because no one had been willing to look at it directly. Brenda sat motionless through all of it, her face draining of color 1 shade at a time. Frank broke first. He pushed off the wall and strode toward the front of the room, pointing at me, his voice rising to a shout. He called me a liar. He called me a troublemaker. He said I had manipulated everyone in this room with edited videos and fabricated documents. He said he knew where I lived and he knew what kind of man I was, and he would make sure I regretted every word I had spoken tonight. Deputy Olson moved before Frank finished the sentence, stepping between us with one hand raised. He told Frank, calmly and clearly, that he had just made a threat in front of 80 witnesses and a law enforcement officer. He advised Frank to stop talking immediately. He suggested that Frank might want to step outside and consider his next words very carefully. Frank's mouth opened and closed twice without sound. Then he turned and walked out the door, slamming it hard enough to rattle the windows. The room watched him go in absolute silence. The board vote took less than 5 minutes. Motion to remove Brenda Kowalski as President 71 in favor, 4 opposed, 8 abstentions. Motion to suspend the Security Patrol Program pending investigation 79 in favor, 0 opposed, 4 abstentions. Motion to rescind all violation notices issued to me in the past 30 days, 73 in favor, 2 opposed, 8 abstentions. Brenda did not speak during the voting. She did not protest or defend herself or demand recounts. She simply gathered her papers, stood up from the table, and walked toward the exit without meeting anyone's eyes. As she passed my row, she paused for half a second. I thought she might say something. She didn't. She kept walking, and the door closed behind her with a soft click that somehow felt louder than Frank's slam. I stayed until the room emptied, answering questions from neighbors who wanted to understand what had happened and what would happen next. Olivia hugged me before she left, tears on her cheeks, thanking me for something I told her she had done herself. When the last person was gone, I stood alone in the clubhouse, looking at the empty chairs and the scattered papers and the table where Brenda had sat for 4 years, pretending her authority was legitimate. My phone buzzed. A text from Tyler State AG office called. They want to interview you tomorrow. I read it twice, then put the phone back in my pocket. Outside, The January wind was blowing, and somewhere in the distance I could hear the scrape of a city plow clearing snow from streets that had nothing to do with Pinecrest Estates. The meeting was over, but the consequences were just beginning. The State Attorney General's investigation concluded 6 weeks after the board meeting. The findings confirmed everything my documentation had suggested and uncovered additional details I hadn't known. Frank Kowalski was charged with criminal trespass for the snow dumping incident spanning 3 winters, and with harassment for his threats against me at the board meeting. He pleaded no contest to both charges and received 12 months of probation, 200 hours of community service, and a restraining order prohibiting contact with me, Olivia Baker, and 3 other residents who had come forward during the investigation. The Pinecrest Patrol LLC was dissolved. Frank's security vest went into a closet somewhere, and he never wore it in the neighborhood again. I saw him occasionally, loading groceries into his truck or checking his mailbox. And each time he looked away before our eyes could meet, I did not feel satisfaction watching him diminish. I felt something closer to relief that he could no longer hurt anyone else. Brenda's consequences were civil rather than criminal, but no less severe. The HOA filed suit against her for breach of fiduciary duty, seeking recovery of the $86,400 paid to her husband's company without authorization. She did not contest the lawsuit. The settlement required full restitution paid over 3 years, plus a formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing that became part of the public record. The state AG's office added her name to a registry of individuals barred from serving on HOA boards in Minnesota for a period of 10 years. She resigned from every community organization she had belonged to. The woman who had controlled Pinecrest Estates through intimidation and bureaucratic manipulation became invisible, a ghost haunting a neighborhood that had finally learned to see through her. I heard through Olivia that she and Frank were considering selling their house. I hoped they would, not because I wanted them gone, but because staying must have felt like its own kind of punishment. The new board took office in February, elected by the largest voter turnout in the HOA's history. Olivia Baker accepted the position of treasurer, overseeing the finances with the meticulous paranoia of someone who had learned exactly how corruption hides in plain sight. The first policy they passed was a comprehensive snow management plan that required all removal contractors to deposit material only on designated common areas, with property lines clearly marked and resident consent documented in writing. The second policy eliminated the security patrol position, replacing it with a contract with a licensed private security firm that carried proper insurance and operated under actual legal authority. The changes were simple, obvious things that should have been standard practice all along, but sometimes obvious things only become visible after someone forces people to look at them. My compensation arrived in March. The HOA paid $2,300 covering the rescinded fines, the fence repair, and a modest amount for time and effort expended. The money mattered less than the letter that accompanied it, a formal apology signed by all 5 new board members acknowledging the harassment I had experienced and committing to prevent similar abuses in the future. I framed the letter and hung it in my garage, next to the plow blade I had used to move the snow that started everything. Tyler thought that was funny. I told him it was a reminder that documentation outlasts denial. Spring arrived slowly that year, the snow retreating in patches as temperatures climbed above freezing for the first time since November. I stood on my back porch one afternoon in late March, watching the last of the ice melt from my sodden yard. The grass underneath was brown and flattened, but already I could see green shoots pushing through, life reasserting itself in the space that had been buried for so long. Olivia walked over from her house, carrying a small potted plant she said was meant for the spot where the snow pile had stood. "Something that blooms in winter," she explained. "So we remember that things can grow even when everything seems frozen." I thanked her and planted it that evening as the sun went down. The ground was soft and damp, finally ready to accept something new. I thought about Brenda's threats, Frank's bluster, the months of isolation and paperwork, and quiet fury. None of it had lasted. The snow was gone. The consequences remained, and in the space where the mountain used to be, something was already beginning to grow.